The sky turned orange at exactly 6:14 in the morning, and every instinct I had screamed that something was terribly wrong. I was reaching for my boots outside the barracks on Kepler 7b when the first wave of color swept across the horizon. It wasn't the warm gold of dawn or the red glow of a distant wildfire. This was something else, an unnatural amber, deep and molten, spreading across the heavens like liquid fire poured over the atmosphere itself. The clouds twisted and burned with that impossible light. For a moment, the entire colony fell silent. Then I saw it. A shadow so vast it seemed to stretch from one end of the sky to the other, moved behind the glowing veil above us. Not a ship, not a meteor, something far larger. My pulse hammered in my ears. Without thinking, I grabbed my rifle. Private Owen Drake appeared beside me, one hand still pulling on his combat jacket. His eyes were fixed on the sky. "Marcus?" he whispered. "What the hell is that?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Because deep down, before the alarms started, before the scanners confirmed it, before command issued a single warning, I already knew. Whatever was descending toward Kepler 7b wasn't here to negotiate. The colony alarm erupted 11 seconds later. My name is Marcus Cole. I was 24 years old when the Brethren arrived, and by sunset, the galaxy's deadliest killers would discover the worst mistake they had ever made. I had been stationed on Kepler 7b for 8 months as part of a small Earth defense garrison. Our job was to protect the agricultural colony from the usual troubles, equipment disputes, boundary issues between farming operations, problems that required a calm voice and a patient hand. Nobody prepared us for this. Kepler 7b was a quiet world. 60,000 civilians, farmers, engineers, teachers, children, one orbital station, 2 patrol ships, and a garrison of 200 soldiers. No strategic value, no rare resources, no reason for anyone in the galaxy to pay us attention. That turned out not to matter. The first breath vessel broke through the atmosphere like a blade through still water. It made almost no sound. That silence was the most unsettling part. Something that large, moving that fast, had no right to be quiet. It was deep gray-black, shaped like a curved talon, and it moved with a smooth and complete certainty that communicated everything before a single word was spoken. It had not come to talk. It had not come to threaten. It had already decided. The broadcast began before the ship had fully descended. Every channel, every comm unit, every radio, every screen in the colony activated simultaneously. I learned later, it was the same across every human world the Breath had targeted that morning. 37 languages delivered at once. They had done thorough research. The voice was flat, not threatening, not cold in the way a person is cold when they are angry. Simply empty, efficient. The voice of a system that had never once considered it might be wrong. Attention biological inhabitants of designated Harvest Zone 74 Alpha. You have been catalogued as Category 3 subivilization. Resistance is not advised. Full compliance will result in orderly processing. You have 30 minutes to cease all communication and assemble in designated open areas. This is your only notification. That was the complete message. No one to speak with, no terms offered, a timer, and an instruction. Lieutenant Nina Lawson was already on the comm to our orbital station. Her face was very still. "Both patrol ships are offline," she said quietly. "Orbit is dark. No debris signature. They were just stopped." "How many ships in the formation?" I asked. She checked her display. A long moment passed. 14 confirmed. More are still coming through the upper atmosphere. 60,000 civilians, 200 soldiers, no orbital support. 14 enemy ships, each one larger than anything in our fleet. Any rational calculation said we had already lost. I pulled on my second boot and laced it. The Breath were not cruel. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for understanding what happened next. Cruelty requires caring about the suffering of another. The Breath did not care. They had a system, a well-developed, thoroughly tested system, built on 41 planetary conquests over 300 years. A captured data archive translated their word for species like us as something close to uncategorized biological resource. Not an enemy, not a threat, not even worth a strategy, just material. That was their first and most fundamental mistake. Their ground units descended at the 20-minute mark. Flat transport discs moving in a tight column, 40 in the first wave, heading toward the central settlement in a perfectly straight line. The soldiers aboard were tall and rigid, covered in hard shell the color of old bone, moving with mechanical precision. They were running a program they had run dozens of times before. They expected it to proceed the way it always had. Private Drake fired before any order was given. Fear made him fast. His shots hit 2 soldiers in the front rank, and both of them went down clean. Not stumbled, not retreated. Down. The formation stopped. In 41 conquests, this had apparently not happened before. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was a pause where there should have been nothing but forward momentum, and it said something that mattered. They were surprised. I did not have time to analyze that. Lieutenant Lawson was already shouting, and every soldier in the garrison was firing. We were not running a rehearsed plan. We were 200 people who had just been told they were going to be processed, and each one of us had reached the same conclusion at the same moment. They pushed us back. That was inevitable. Better weapons, heavier armor, larger numbers, and the practiced efficiency of a force that had never encountered meaningful resistance. We lost 17 soldiers in the first 20 minutes. They lost 9. That number should have been far more lopsided. Their communications shifted from slow and steady to rapid and clipped. We could hear it in the frequency patterns. We held the agricultural storage complex for 6 hours. We were not winning. Holding is not winning. But we were making them pay for every meter, and that was more than their system had accounted for. At hour 4, a signal arrived through a low-power channel that a civilian engineer named Claire Webb had kept alive using a relay buried under the water processing unit. She had no military rank. No one had told her to do it. And she had decided it needed doing, and she had done it. The message was from Earth Combined Command. Other colonies were fighting back, not just Kepler 7b. Across every human-settled world the Vareth had targeted in their opening push, people were refusing to comply. Some had already lost significant ground. None had surrendered. The breath broadcast had gone to the entire galaxy. Every space-faring civilization received it as standard Dominion procedure. It was a public notice. Humanity was claimed. The rest of the galaxy was expected to observe quietly, the way 41 civilizations before us had taught them to expect. What the galaxy observed that day was nothing it had expected. At hour 6, one of our patrol ships reappeared on scope. Its crew of 11 had been playing dead in the debris field near the orbital station, drifting outside scanner range, making repairs by hand. The pilot, a woman named Greta Lane, had held a conduit together with wire stripped from her seat harness. The ship had no logical reason to be operational. It fired anyway. The breath command vessel above our colony took a solid impact to its lower section and rolled hard before stabilizing. Not a killing strike, but across their entire formation, every commander received the same data point simultaneously. Their system said this should not be possible. Somewhere in the wider galaxy, other species were watching, placing measured bets on how many weeks humanity had left. A few were generous enough to guess months. Not one of them said years. Drake was reloading for the 4th time, moving on pure training. Claire Webb was still at her station, a cut on her forehead she had not stopped to wipe clean. Nina Lawson was already restructuring our defense line for the next advance. We were tired. We were running low on everything. We had lost people who would not be coming back. We were still here. The breath had built their empire on a simple certainty. Every species has a breaking point. Find it quickly, apply pressure, and the world submits. They had never encountered a species that had spent 10,000 years learning how not to break. They were about to begin their education. My name is Petra Stone, and 6 months into the war, I produced a 40-page intelligence report that became one of the most read documents in Earth Combined Command history. I want to be honest about what it was. Not a celebration of our performance, not a prediction of victory, a careful and clinical answer to a question that no one had clearly asked yet. Why were we still alive? I had spent 12 years studying alien biology before the breath came. Atmospheric organisms on remote moons, deep water chemical systems on ocean worlds. Quiet, patient, entirely non-threatening work. When the war started, and Combined Command pulled every analyst they could find, I expected to be assigned somewhere peripheral. Instead, I found myself buried in engagement records, intercepted communications, and medical reports from 43 separate combat actions across 12 worlds. What I found was not what the commanders expected. The breath were not losing. I put that in large plain text at the beginning of the report, because I knew the instinct would be to read what followed as a victory narrative. It was not. The Breath had taken 4 colony worlds. Their technology remained superior to ours in most categories. Their numbers were larger, and their supply lines were more established. On every objective measure, the war was still going their way, but they were not comfortable. And in a species that had never experienced discomfort during a conquest, that discomfort was spreading through their command structure like a disease nobody had a name for. The first thing I identified was adaptation rate. In every previous Breath campaign, they had adjusted their tactics at most twice across the entire subjugation process. The target species would attempt something, the Breath would counter it. The species had no answer, because no species had the institutional experience of sustained resistance. Done. Against humanity, the Breath had revised their ground tactics 14 times in 6 months. We had matched or answered 11 of those 14 shifts. This was not because our commanders were exceptional, though some were very sharp. It was because every one of our soldiers and officers had been trained on scenarios involving failure. Scenarios where communications went down, where support did not arrive, where the rational outcome of a situation was bad, and the job was to find a way through it anyway. Human military history is at its core a continuous curriculum in recovering from catastrophe. The Breath had no such curriculum. When their previous opponents failed, they submitted. There was no next phase to plan for. The second thing I identified was physiological. It took me 2 full weeks of medical data review to accept what I was reading. Breath soldiers had a neurological response to serious injury that essentially suspended their higher cognitive function. Not death, but something close to a forced shutdown. A biological protection that had evolved over millennia. A badly wounded Breath soldier ceased to be a combatant almost immediately. It was in its own way a compassionate system. It was also the source of every projection error the Breath had made about us. Humans in pain continued to operate. Humans with injuries that should have ended a fight did not end the fight. Field medics reported soldiers continuing to function through conditions that had no precedent in Breath combat models. Not because they were unaware of their situation, but because they had chosen to continue anyway. That distinction, the difference between cannot stop and will not stop, was invisible in the Breath data. Their casualty math assumed a clean, direct relationship between physical damage and fighting capacity. Against humans, that math was consistently wrong. There was a Breath field commander who became something of a legend in our intelligence division. His translated designation was Sector Cast Prime Odin. Over 6 months of intercepted communications, his reports went through a clear progression. In month 1, confident dispatches filled with standard operational language. In month 2, a careful note of puzzlement. In month 3, something that read like alarm, filtered through the rigid formality of Breath military convention. His final report submitted, before he was pulled from command. Read in translation. The engagement parameters of this species do not conform to established models. Every projection has required revision. Recommend suspension of standard subjugation timeline, pending thorough reassessment. In 41 conquests, no Breath-refield commander had ever written a message like that. His superiors removed him for what their internal records called performance deviation. We intercepted that order too. The analyst who found it pinned a copy to the wall of our operations room. The third finding was the one I kept returning to in quiet moments, because it went beyond tactics and beyond physiology. It was about production. 6 months into the war, Earth's manufacturing output had quadrupled. Not because new facilities had been built, because every existing facility had been converted, reorganized, and pushed past every previous limit. Universities had redirected entire departments toward material science and propulsion engineering. Companies that made agricultural equipment were producing armored components. Engineers who had designed climate management systems were adapting those same atmospheric principles to weapon design. Retired specialists were being recalled. Young people were enrolling in accelerated technical programs at a rate that no projection model had anticipated. The Breath analysts who captured our early cargo manifests reportedly ran the numbers 4 times before accepting them as accurate. A field intelligence report we eventually translated noted that the review team had confirmed the figures and that the original analyst had flagged the situation as categorically without known precedent. That note was filed and dismissed. It was a mistake that cost them 6 consecutive engagements in the months that followed. I finished my analysis and added a final section that I almost cut. because it felt like it stretched beyond my assignment. It concerned a sane observer named Voris, attached to the Galactic Neutral Assembly, who had been sending increasingly unusual reports home since the first week of the war. One of those reports had been passed to our intelligence division by a sane diplomatic aide who appeared to have developed genuine personal concern about where this was heading. Voris had done something no breath analyst had ever done. Read the complete available record of human historical conflict from beginning to end. What they found was not a history of effective warfare. It was a history of near extinction survived. A history of civilizations destroyed and rebuilt larger each time. Every catastrophe had become eventually a foundation for something more durable. Voris wrote to their government, "This species does not treat civilizational disaster as a final state. They treat it as a problem with a solution and a lesson with a use." Every destruction in their record became the basis for the next construction. I do not believe the VTH Dominion has encountered this characteristic before. I do not believe they understand what they have started. I printed that paragraph and put it above my desk. 2 months after I submitted my report, Earth Combined Command launched the first coordinated counteroffensive. Not a local push, a full offensive campaign into breath-controlled space, supported by months of preparation and supply organization that dwarfed anything in our previous military history. I stood on an observation deck at Luna Station and watched the fleet move out, ship after ship crossing the dark, steady and deliberate, purpose-built, crewed by people who had 6 months of the hardest possible experience behind them, carrying 14 months of full operational supply. I thought about Odin, pulled from his command for telling the truth. I thought about Claire Webb sitting at her transmitter with a cut on her forehead. I thought about Marcus Cole somewhere on a colony world, having reached the same conclusion as everyone else that quiet morning. Then I went back to my desk. The breath were already trying to work out what we were going to do next. I went back to making sure they kept failing at that. My first command decision after breaking the breath front line in Sector 9 was not what anyone around me expected. We had momentum for the first time in this war. We had a numerical advantage in the engagement zone, and the breath formation ahead was pulling back in disarray. Every tactical model said to push forward immediately. Take the ground. Keep them moving backward. Do not let them breathe. I ordered a complete stop. 6-hour rest cycle for all crews. My flag captain, Adrian Hunt, looked at me the way you look at someone who has done something you cannot immediately explain. They will use those 6 hours to reorganize, he said. They will try, I said. But mostly, they will spend those 6 hours trying to understand why we stopped. And I would rather they spend their time on that problem than on getting ready for us. My name is Kira Voss, 19 years in the Earth Defense Fleet before the Vreth arrived. 3 territorial disputes, 2 deep space survey commands, and more military history than any reasonable person would voluntarily read. The piece of history I returned to most often during the counteroffensive was not a famous battle. It was a logistics study from a continental war fought nearly 3 centuries before I was born. The study had a simple conclusion. In every sustained conflict it examined, the decisive factor was not who had better weapons. It was who could keep fighting after everyone expected them to stop. Supply lines, fuel, medical support, replacement parts, communication, the invisible machinery that turns tactical success into something that actually ends a war. The Breath had never needed to master this, because their campaigns had never run long enough to require it. Hit fast, hit hard, collect submission. Done. We were going to give them long. We were going to give them a fight that their system had never modeled, and their commanders had no training for. The first human expeditionary fleet left Luna Station with 14 months of full operational supply capacity. Not ration supply, full operation maintained continuously. The breath analysts who obtained our early cargo manifests ran the numbers 4 times before accepting them. A captured field intelligence report noted that the review team had confirmed the figures, and that the original analyst had filed a secondary report calling the situation unprecedented. That secondary report had been dismissed. That dismissal cost them 6 engagements. The defining battle of the counteroffensive was not the largest fight we took part in. It was not the most technically complex engagement. It was 11 days of deliberate grinding patience at a choke point, our maps labeled Junction Point Kappa, and our crews called the doorstep, in the way soldiers name things that are dangerous and they have to face anyway. The breath defensive line there had held for 3 weeks before we arrived. Natural choke point between two dense asteroid fields, heavily fortified, staffed by a veteran cast unit under a commander whose translated designation was Grand Sector Prime Tail. He had never lost a defensive position. His reputation across the Dominion was built on tactical clarity and absolute discipline under pressure. We did not try to break through the line. We parked in front of it for 11 days. We conducted small probing attacks that achieved nothing decisive. We rotated crews on a 6-hour schedule, so everyone stayed sharp and rested. We repaired, resupplied from our mobile logistics depot, and waited. From the outside, it looked like indecision. It looked like fear of committing to a full push. It looked, in short, like weakness. That was the point. On day 7, our communications team began pulling Tail's internal reports. He was filing with increasing frequency and increasingly compressed language, describing our behavior as without precedent in his operational training. He could not understand why we were not attacking in force or withdrawing. We matched nothing in the strategic models he had ever worked with. He had begun rerouting his own supply chains to sustain his extended defensive hold. His fleet was drawing down on reserves that had been designated for the next phase of the campaign. By day 11, his fuel reserves were at 60%. Ours were at 94%. I ordered the full push on day 12. His line held for 9 hours. Then the left flank gave way. Then the center tail retreated in good order because he was a skilled commander, and he made the right call once the position became unsustainable. But he was retreating with depleted reserves into a sector where the next defensive layer had counted on his hold, buying time for preparation. That layer was not ready. We went through it in 36 hours. I am not going to pretend the offensive was clean. We lost ships. We lost crews. Some of those losses were people I had known for a decade. People whose names came to me before I was fully awake some mornings, and have not stopped since. There is no version of this story where that part is anything but what it is. I am not going to wrap it in language that makes it easier. We moved for the first time in this war. We were not responding to what the breath did. We were deciding, and they were the ones scrambling to read us. The moment that stays with me most from the entire campaign did not happen in a battle. It happened on a boarding operation at a captured command station in Sector 11. I led the boarding team personally. My senior officers objected. They were probably right. But I had spent 2 years absorbing reports about the breath through layers of analysis and translation, and I needed to see something with my own eyes without filters. The station commander was an archcast officer, the highest military rank the Reth had. His translated designation was Grand Prime Overseer Reeth. He was tall and formally composed, marked with the deep ceremonial patterns of his caste. When we entered his command chamber, he stood perfectly straight in the posture that breath officers took when they were prepared for what their tradition considered the honorable conclusion of a failed campaign. He expected to be killed, that was the code. A commander who lost his station had failed his caste. He was by every definition his culture had finished. I walked across the chamber and held out a datapad. He looked at it. He looked at me. He looked at the datapad again. "What is this?" His translator rendered. "Terms of negotiation," I said. The translation unit cycled for a moment. The closest phrase it could produce was something like, "Conditional cessation protocols offered by a lower-ranked party." "We are not the lower-ranked party," I said. He was quiet for a long time. I have no way to know what passed through his mind in those seconds. His report, which we translated eventually, said only that the human commander had offered formal negotiation from a position of tactical dominance without ceremony, without visible anger, and without any apparent need to establish superiority. He wrote that he had no procedural category for this situation. That was the heart of the breath's problem. They had a perfect, refined, thoroughly tested system for conquest. They had no system for an opponent who had beaten them and was now offering something other than either submission or destruction. I sent him back to the Dominion with the datapad and a complete record of our current fleet strength, not as a threat, as information. The breath made decisions based on clear data. I was giving them new data. Adrian was waiting when I returned to my ship. "Did it work?" he asked. "Not yet," I said, "but it will." 6 weeks later, the Breath High Council opened a formal communication channel. The chamber of the Galactic Neutral Assembly held representatives from 62 worlds. And every one of them was watching me, with the focused attention you give something you are not entirely sure is safe to stop watching. That was acceptable. I did not need them comfortable. I needed them present, and I needed them to make a decision. My name is Len Ehoro. 23 years in diplomatic service before Earth Combined Command assigned me as our first formal assembly ambassador. I had resolved water rights disputes between remote outposts, talked corporate territorial conflicts back from the edge of something worse, handled 3 separate border incidents that had every ingredient for becoming far more serious. I was good at reading rooms. This room was unlike anything I had encountered. 3.5 years after the first breath ship broke atmosphere above Kepler 7b, the war was effectively over. The Breath High Council was still in deliberation, still repositioning their remaining fleet assets in patterns that our analysts described as uncertain rather than aggressive. But the Dominion had lost its front lines, lost 4 of its 6 primary staging worlds, and lost something that no military asset could replace: the assumption of inevitability. 41 civilizations had submitted to the breath. Humanity had not. The galaxy had watched all of it happen from the moment the first broadcast went out, and now the galaxy had to decide what to do with what it had seen. I arrived at the assembly station with one aide, a young man named Dale Marsh, who had the specific quality of remaining calm in situations that offered no obvious reason for calm. I had chosen him for exactly that. My prepared statement had been rewritten 14 times. The final version was the shortest. In 23 years of diplomatic work, the most effective things I had ever said were the simplest ones. The session opened with formal proceedings. 3 civilizations filed motions to delay humanity's application for permanent assembly membership on grounds of insufficient documentation of long-term behavioral stability. 2 others proposed a monitoring period of not less than 10 years before any formal status could be granted. 1. The Gorathi Collective submitted a motion using language that our translation team rendered as preventive containment review, which was diplomatic phrasing for exactly what it sounded like. I listened to all of it without expression. Dale leaned toward me. "They are frightened of us." "Yes," I said. "Is that a problem?" "It is if we handle it wrong." When my turn to address the chamber arrived, I stood without notes. Notes pull your attention down and away from the room. You cannot hold a room if you are reading at it. Every civilization in this chamber has made a rational choice at some point in its history. I began a choice based on available information, on realistic assessment of possibilities, on a clear understanding of what survival requires. Every species here has at some critical moment decided that the cost of resistance was not worth paying. Many of you made that decision because of the breath. I'm not here to criticize that decision. I am here to explain why we made a different one. Total silence across 62 species, not because we are braver, not because we are more capable, but because of something specific in our history that I want you to understand. Because without it, nothing you observed over the past 4 years makes any sense. I had spent 2 months working with Petra Stone's intelligence division before this session. I had read every analysis and every translated breath document available to us. I had also read, at the suggestion of the sane observer, Voris, the full historical archives of 3 civilizations that the breath had absorbed before this war began. Species that had been our equals in technology and social organization. Species that had submitted. What distinguished them from us was not resources, not population count, not military capability. It was the specific texture of our history. Those civilizations had never fought themselves at scale. They had disputes and conflicts, but the kind of war that grinds across continents for generations, that reduces cities to foundations and then rebuilds them larger, that forces a species to look directly at the real possibility of its own extinction and develop the tools to survive it anyway, that was ours alone. The breath had found our conflict record and classified it as extreme instability, a high priority, rapid subjugation target. They had read the record with perfect accuracy and understood it completely wrong. We have fought each other across continents and across centuries. I told the chamber, we have developed weapons capable of ending our civilization, and then lived with those weapons for generations, choosing not to use them. Not because we were wise enough not to want to, because we understood the consequences well enough to choose differently. Every catastrophe in our history produced not only destruction, but the knowledge of how to survive the next one. Each of us standing here is the product of people who refused at every critical moment to accept that the story was finished. The translation systems worked steadily. No one in the chamber moved. "You are afraid of what we might become," I said. "Some of you are calculating whether it would be safer to contain us now before we grow into something you cannot contain. I understand that calculation. It is the same logic that has kept this assembly functioning for 4 centuries. I paused for a full 5 seconds, but I want you to consider this. We were fighting for survival for 4 years, and we were still watching everything else that was happening in this galaxy. We know which fleets pulled back from our borders. We know which diplomatic channels went quiet. We know which species sent observers, and which sent intelligence assets. We tracked all of it because that is what we do. And we are telling you this not as a threat, but because we want you to understand one thing about us clearly. We are observant. We are patient, and we are all the product of a civilization that has had to learn over and over again how to live alongside people we do not fully trust." A ripple of movement moved through the chamber. "We are not asking to be welcomed. I said we are asking to be included. There is a significant difference. We are not here to lead this assembly or to change its structure. We are here because there are problems in this galaxy that none of us can address alone. And we have just spent 4 years demonstrating that we do not disappear when things become difficult." The formal vote was scheduled for the following morning. What happened that evening was not something I had planned for. Voris requested a private meeting. When I arrived at the location, there was a second person in the room, a quiet representative from a civilization I will not name here because their government had not authorized public acknowledgement of what they were about to tell me. They told me that 2 minor species currently recorded in assembly documentation as having voluntarily reduced contact with the wider galactic community had not done so voluntarily. The Vray had been conducting quiet extraction operations on their worlds for 11 years, operating under administrative paperwork the assembly had approved without thorough review. I sat with that information for a long time. Dale was with me when I returned to our quarters. I told him what I had learned. He was quiet for a while. "What do we do?" he asked. "What we do," I said. The next morning, before the session opened, I withdrew our membership application temporarily and filed an emergency investigative commission on the status of the 2 affected species through back channels. I also redirected 2 fleet assets in the region to conduct what I formally noted as a welfare verification transit through the affected systems. No one had asked us to do it. There was no political gain in it. 3 assembly members filed protests that we were acting without standing. Those protests were withdrawn before they were formally processed. Vori told me afterward. "They watched your ships move," Vori said, "and they decided they want you on the right side of whatever comes next." The vote the following afternoon was not unanimous. The Gorathi abstained, 2 others abstained, but the motion passed with a margin that would have been unthinkable at the start of that session. Dale was grinning the entire shuttle ride home. "We got a seat at the table," he said. "We got the first part done," I said. "Now we have to figure out what to actually do with it." I looked out the viewport at the stars. 3 days earlier, a long-range probe near the outer boundary of former breath-controlled space had returned signals that our analysts had not yet classified. Not a natural source, not anything in any database. Something had been watching this war from a very long distance. I thought about that the whole way home. I was 31 years old when I set foot on the Breath homeworld. 24 when the war started. I had spent the 7 years between those 2 moments covering more distance than I can meaningfully measure, losing more people than I want to try to count, and becoming so thoroughly different from the person who stood outside a barracks with 1 boot in his hand, that sometimes I looked in a mirror and needed a moment to find myself in the face looking back. The VHT homeworld was called Vist Prime in our phonetic rendering. It was cold. Not the brutal cold of a hostile climate, but a deep and persistent chill that settled into your joints after a few hours outside and stayed there. The sky was dark gray-green, heavy with clouds that never quite broke. The buildings were tall and angular, constructed entirely for function, with no curves, no softness, no concession to decoration. Everything was built to last and built to purpose. Looking at those buildings, I understood something about the breath that no intelligence report had fully conveyed. They were not a species that had chosen efficiency as a philosophy. They were a species for whom efficiency was simply the default condition of existence. Their entire civilization was organized around the elimination of waste. Wasted time, wasted material, wasted motion. Even their conquest program at its foundation was a resource management system. an empire-wide effort to eliminate what they considered the waste of uncoordinated independent civilizations. That understanding did not make what they had done acceptable. It made them real in a way that years of reading files never had. The reconstruction team I was assigned to had 42 people from 6 Earth nations, 4 sane specialists serving as neutral observers, and a Breath civilian liaison officer whose translated designation was Compliance Administrator Heron. Heron had been assigned to us by the new Breath Transitional Council, which was trying to manage the Dominion's collapse into something organized enough to survive. Heron was the first Breath civilian I had ever spoken with directly. Every Breath I had encountered before was either military or no longer alive. Standing in the intake bay of our temporary compound outside the capital district, I realized I had been carrying a mental image built over 7 years of combat that had nothing to do with the individual in front of me. Heron was nervous. The shell shifted slightly. The compound eyes moved in a pattern that our team xenobiologist, a sharp young man named Chris Arden, identified as the Breath equivalent of anxious fidgeting. Heron was nervous about meeting us. That hit me harder than I expected. "Administrator Heron," I said through the translation unit. "My name is Marcus Cole. I am heading the Human Reconstruction Liaison Team. We are here to work with your Transitional Council on infrastructure and supply restoration. We are not here to direct your decisions. We are here to help carry them out." Heron was quiet for several seconds. Then the translator rendered, "You are smaller than I expected." I looked at Chris. Chris looked at me. "Fair enough," I said. The work was hard in a way that was entirely different from combat. Combat has a clear direction. The problem is coming from somewhere and you push back. Reconstruction has no direction. Problems arrive from everywhere simultaneously, and they are all equally urgent, and none of them respond to force. The VTH civilian population of Vathrimi was approximately 900 million. Roughly 40% of them were warrior caste or caste adjacent, meaning their entire social identity had been organized around the Dominion's expansion operations. That structure no longer existed. The supply networks it had sustained no longer existed. 4 out of every 10 people on this world had no established framework for what they were supposed to do. Now, our first week was consumed by food distribution systems. The Breath civilian infrastructure was functional in isolation, but it had been designed to route resources inward from occupied worlds, and that pipeline was gone. Heron walked me through the logistics with careful precision. He was thorough and exacting, and he asked exactly the right questions at every stage. By the 3rd day, I had stopped thinking of him as a former enemy and started thinking of him as a very capable colleague, and I was not entirely sure what to do with that. Back on Earth, the political situation was not clean. We received briefings twice weekly from Combined Command, a faction within the Earth Council organized under the name the Security and Reparation Alliance, was pressing hard for an extraction agreement with the Vreth. Formal reparations in the form of raw material access, planetary resource leases, and mandatory technology transfer obligations. The numbers they proposed were not punitive by accident. They were structured to ensure the Breath remained economically dependent for decades. Ambassador Aworo was contesting this in every chamber available to him. Petra Stone had submitted a secondary analysis showing that a Breath civilization kept in structured dependency was several times more likely to produce a serious destabilization event within 20 years than one given a genuine framework for recovery. The modeling was careful and well-sourced. The Alliance called it speculative. I received a short personal message from Lena Coro in our 2nd week. It said, "What you find on the ground matters. Write it down. Send it. All of it." So I did. I wrote about the Breath children I saw in the distribution lines. Their shells were pale, the color of fresh bone before it ages, and they moved with a quiet uncertainty that was completely different from the rigid efficiency of the adults around them. I wrote about the residential districts where entire caste compounds had gone silent because the social structures that had defined them no longer existed, and no one had given anyone guidance on what came next. I wrote about the craftwork I found in market stalls, unexpected and intricate, geometric and genuinely beautiful, made by people who had apparently been producing it in private for years because their caste code had not included it as an authorized activity. I wrote about Harun sitting at our shared planning table at the end of the 4th day, looking at a supply network map, saying quietly through his translator, "The Council built all of this to move outward. None of it was designed to move inward. Everything was built to take, not to circulate. I sat with that for a moment. That is something you can change, I said. He looked at me. Can it be changed? Yes, I said. It is hard, and it takes time, and it requires convincing a great many people who benefited from the old system that the new one is worth their effort. But it is possible. We know it is possible because we have done it. Not perfectly, not always, but enough times to know the direction is right. He was quiet for a while. Then your species does that, changes direction. Sometimes, I said, when we manage to agree on which direction to go. Your internal political communications suggest that agreement is not always straightforward. He said it was the most precise way anyone had ever described the current Earth Council situation. No, I said, it is not always straightforward. Reports went to Loro, and from there, eventually into the Earth Council chambers. Whether they made a measurable difference, I cannot say with certainty. What I know is that the Security and Reparation Alliance's most aggressive proposals failed their votes by margins that had not existed 3 weeks earlier. The final agreement included material assistance obligations, but structured as temporary and declining, tied to benchmarks for breath civic stability, not extraction, not dependency. A defined timeline toward genuine recovery. It was not perfect. The representatives who had wanted harder terms were still present, still watching, still ready to revisit the question if conditions shifted. That pressure was not going away, but the framework was something I could look at without flinching. The hardest day of the assignment came in week 5. A community in the Eastern Capital District had been experiencing sustained civil tension between former warrior caste residents and the technical caste population. The technical caste residents were adjusting. They had skills the new economy could use immediately, and a social identity that did not collapse without the dominion structure to support it. The warrior caste residents had neither. They had held status and purpose within a system that no longer existed, and the gap between where they had been and where they were was a dangerous pressure with nowhere to go. Harun and I went to the district together. No official escort by mutual agreement. He had proposed it, and I had agreed, because I trusted his read on his own people more than I trusted the briefing documents by that point. We spent 4 hours in a community hall with former warrior caste residents who had never in their lives been in a room with a human, and simply talked. The conversation was slow and awkward through the translation units. They asked me things about the war that no analysis had ever captured, because the analyses were built on our perspective. They wanted to know what it had felt like to fight the breath when everything in your situation said you should have already stopped. I answered honestly. It felt like the most frightening experience of my life. I told them, and also the most clarifying. When everything else falls away and the only real question is whether you are going to keep moving forward or stop, you find out something about yourself very quickly. One of the warrior caste men, old enough that his shell had developed the deep amber tinting that breath biology associated with advanced age, was quiet for a long time after my answer. Then he said, "Your species was afraid," and continued, "Anyway, yes. I said our doctrine classifies that as irrational behavior." He said, "Your doctrine was wrong about us." I said, "That is why we are sitting in this room together, instead of the other outcome." He was quiet again. Then he made a gesture that Chris Arden later identified after reviewing everything in the Xenobiological Archive as the breath expression of acknowledgement between two individuals who have reached a genuine understanding across a significant divide. I did not know what to do, except nod back. On the morning of the 42nd day, a message came through on the combined command frequency outside the normal briefing schedule. It was from Len Aoro, marked urgent. Voris had requested direct communication with the human reconstruction team on Veith Prime. The forwarded message carried Aoro's personal note. "Read this carefully before you make any plans for what comes after this assignment." Voris's transmission was detailed, measured, and between the careful lines of a professional observer's language, deeply serious. Long-range probes at the outer boundary of former breath-controlled space had been returning signals over the past 8 months. The signals had been analyzed, cross-referenced, reanalyzed by 3 independent teams and confirmed. They were not random. They were not natural sources. They were observations, directed, regular, methodical recordings of the conflict that had just ended. Every major engagement captured, every fleet movement logged. The whole 4 years of the war recorded from a distance. Whatever was producing the signal was not in any archive available to any species in the known galaxy. Voris added a second piece. The Vareth High Council held a classified historical archive that had not been included in the materials turned over during the armistice process. Voris had accessed a partial summary through back channels. The archive documented encounters at the outer boundary, going back nearly 2 centuries. Brief contacts quickly ended, each time assessed by the Breath as beyond current engagement capacity and flagged for future strategic consideration. They had never reached that future. We were standing at the edge of it now. I sat in the small office that had become mine over 6 weeks on Vith Prime and read the message 3 times. Outside, Haran was coordinating with the supply teams over the water reclamation project. We had finally gotten moving. Chris Arden was working through medical supply logistics at the Eastern District Clinic. 42 people from 6 nations, doing the slow, difficult, entirely unglamorous work of helping a broken civilization figure out how to be something other than what it had been. I thought about what was out there past that boundary, something patient enough to observe a 4-year war without announcing itself, something methodical enough to document every engagement, something that had made the Breath nervous enough to bury the record in a sealed archive and say nothing about it to anyone. I wrote a reply to Lynn Okoro. I kept it short. I said, "We need to finish what we started here. Do that completely and do it right. And then we need to start thinking carefully about what comes next. I do not know what that looks like yet, but whatever it is, we need to face it together, with every piece of information on the table, and no comfortable assumptions. That is the only way we have ever managed anything that actually lasted." I sent it and went back outside. Haran was at the supply table with 3 junior coordinators, pointing at a schematic of the Eastern Water Distribution Line with the focused attention he brought to every task, large or small. He looked up when I approached. "The reclamation junction in Sector 4 is cleared," he said. "Line restoration can begin before the end of the day." "Good," I said. "Your medical officer also confirms the Eastern District Clinic is fully operational, as of this morning," he added. "Good," I said again. Haran made the gesture. The one that meant acknowledgement between 2 people who had found a way across a difficult space to reach something like understanding. I reached into my jacket pocket. I had been carrying a ration pack since the previous afternoon, meaning to eat it at the planning table, forgetting about it, carrying it again. I pulled it out and opened it, standing there in the cold, gray-green morning air of a world that a year ago had been an enemy capital. It was not good food, dense and dry, with the flavor of compressed material, and a distant suggestion of something that might once have been bread. Nothing like home. Nothing like the kind of unhurried breakfast that belongs to mornings when you do not know what is coming. But the sky above me was still. No orange in the clouds, no sound of anything falling or breaking, just the cold and the wind and the sound of Haran's team working on the water lines. And somewhere on the other side of the compound, Chris Arden's voice going through a logistics checklist. 7 years ago, I had been eating a real breakfast when everything changed. An ordinary morning, the kind that only exists fully in memory once it is gone. This was not that. This was dry rations on a cold alien world, with work that would take years, and problems that had no clean solutions, and something unknown waiting past the boundary of everything we had mapped. But we were here, all of us still here, still moving, still doing the next necessary thing, without waiting for someone to tell us it was possible. Whatever was out there watching us, whatever had been recording and waiting and measuring the war we had just finished, it was going to find out the same thing the Breath had found out. We do not stop, we do not fold. We get tired and we get hurt, and we lose people, and we keep going anyway, because that is what we have always done. And because somewhere inside the long history of everything we have survived, we learned that forward is the only direction worth committing to. I finished the ration pack. I tucked the wrapper into my pocket, because I had learned long ago not to leave anything behind that you do not have to. Then I went back to work.